Jeg kom over denne videoen fra DNB i dag, og da viser det hvor panikk det i bankene herrene nå. Her står han frem og skal forklare at hvor sikre og gode bankene og han snakker noen banker gode, de bygger seg opp, og noen banker ikke mye svart og alt. Men han skrøyter om hvor gode de og hva som har skjedd de siste årene. Men han nevner ingenting det som skal skje de neste 2 årene. Om de har bygd aldri så mye egenkapital og DNB, og snakker om andre banker, hva feil andre banker har gjort. Altså, du snakker ned andre banker for å heve deg selv. Det bruker han et kvarter på. Men han nevner ingenting om alle utfordringene. Den norske lave krona, ja, hva betyr det for norsk økonomi? Oljefondet som er plassert i utlandet og utenlandske banker, der de svake bankene, hva konsekvenser kan det få for Norge? Hvis økonomien i verden går ned og oljefondet, ja, hva skjer da med Norge? Han nevner ikke sånne ting. Men han snakker om de dårlige bankene i utlandet, og det benekter han ikke. Inflasjonen i utlandet er jo høyere. Ting stiger i utlandet, svakere krone, ergo får vi dobbel effekt, så alt vi importerer, vi får en enorm prisstigning i Norge. Det nevner han ikke. Denne en enorme skattepolitikk i Norge, at folk flytter ut fra Norge, for det blir skattet i hel. Hva konsekvenser for det for Norge? Nevner det ikke engang. Så det er tydelig at DNB Markets og Ole Kjennerud prøver å kunne dempe frykten. Dempe frykten i norske banksystemet, som faktisk står på leirgrunn. Det er jo det de gjør nå. Sånn at han tydelig at han prøver å dempe en ulmende brann som kommer. Folk er nervøse nå, så man liksom ut og så, ja, men bankene er gode, ja, bankene er gode, Norges største bank er gode, den, ja. Men når du ikke snakker om, i plass for å snakke drit om så mange andre banker, og liksom å få heve seg selv og fortelle hvor gode de hadde vært, så nevner han ikke det kan man gå i møte med alt det der med utfordringene vi har nå. Det synes jeg er utrolig underlig ifra denne her bankmannen. Jeg har skrevet litt om det her selv, så jeg forstår ingenting. Er det ingen i banksystemet som kan se ting fra fugleperspektiv, de ser ting henger sammen hele bildet? Er det bare sånne sektorøkonomer, en greier på det, en på det, så snakker de ikke sammen, de klarer ikke koble tankene sammen? Jeg fatter det ikke. Jeg fatter ikke hvor en økonom setter opp til å tenke. Jeg fatter det ikke. Ikke nevner dette med BlackRock, så for å styrke økonomien. For det BlackRock, det er jo Agenda 2030, de som kjøper på eiendommer, banker og sånne ting. Når bankene går over ende, så er det BlackRock som kommer og kjøper dette opp, og Avgard og disse store firmaene. Og dette her er jo mest like, at bare BlackRock er jo mest vårt like stor så oljefondet i Norge. Og når vi får litt skjelving på børsen og valuta justerer litt, så skal vi se om ikke oljefondet bare en skygge av seg selv øyeblikk, tror jeg. For de viktige tingene, det snakker han ikke en tøddel om. Dette med BRICS-land og dollar, nå, 30% skal ut av dollar og inn i lokale valuta. Så det nevner ikke han i DNB engang. Får de ikke inn sånne nyheter, nei? Eller er det en planlagt nedsmelting de skal til med? At banker, politikere, enten de har ikke kunnskapene, de er staur i helvete og dumme, eller så er det en planlagt, de prøver å helle det skjult for folket. Jeg kan ikke svare hva det er, en kombinasjon. For jeg kan ikke forstå ikke folk ser det når det er så mye fokus på dette i utlandet nå. Dette er jo da en utenlandsk artikkel, så jeg har Google-oversett. Og samme artikkelen finner du også på Steigan også. Og det er jo det med mange som mener at Steigan, det er konspirasjonsteori. Det er bare tull det. Steigan, mye av artiklene Steigan har, det er sånne artikler de finner i utlandet, og oversetter på norsk, og så får du finne på en norsk plattform. For det er veldig vanskelig å finne sånne artikler på nettet. Det er så utrolig mye. Men da er det mange herrene største sauene i Norge som mener nå at det står på dokumentet, det står på steigen, da er det konspirasjonsteorier. Og det viser jo hvem som er sauherrene, for de forstår ikke dette herrene. Og det skjer så mye i økonomien, og når jeg så han herrene da, så ikke, så tenkte jeg, herregud for hvor lite kompetanse han har. Er det rett og slett manipulasjonen heller på liksom folk skal sove godt og tro at det går godt i Norge? Men Norge er en del av en global økonomi, en global system, og det som skjer i utlandet, det er med haleheng med en gang. Og spesielt med dollaren, når folk begynner å gå ut av dollaren. Det nevner de ikke engang i Norge. Det viser bare hvor manipulert dette landet er. Her er det også et land over verden slipper amerikansk dollar. Det er jo det de snakker om nå, overalt nå, at denne dollaren herrene er ferset ut av dette her greiene. Her kan du lese masse utenlandske artikler, men jeg ser ingenting i norske medier om dette. Ingenting. Jeg har ikke sett noe i norske medier. Jeg holder tett om sånne ting. Det er derfor jeg mener det er en planlagt politisk at Norge skal tas ned, så knuses det økonomisk. Det er agendaen til politikerne. Ikke sikkert de vet det selv engang, men da er det i hvert fall de som gir de ordre, for det er bare ordremottaker, de tenker jo ferdig ikke selv. Så det er jo det som er problemet i dag, at vi har ikke politikere som kan tenke og kreative og klare å se ting i et større sammenheng, for det er fullt av rådgivere, kommunikasjonsrådgivere og konsulenter som hjelper de her og hjelper de der, så er ingen som klarer å se hele bildet før det er for sent. De tror teori og praksis går ikke alltid i hånd i handsker, sånn er det bare. Og det er det norske politikere har stort problem med å forstå, tror jeg. Så det er så mye informasjon nå på utenlandske med dette med dollaren, for det er jo en verdenshappening det som skjer med dollaren og BRICS og poeterdollaren. Men det leser de ikke i norske medier. Det er det store 1000-kronerspørsmål. Hvorfor skal ikke vi lese om dette i Norge? Det er da du kan begynne å lure på om det er en større plan, det de holder på med. Her har du da originalt denne artikkelen. Så det er en video også her, så kan vi forstå det.
Since the 1940s and the end of World War II, the global economy has been dominated by the US dollar, and this has given the United States a lot of power that it has used to impose its political will on countries around the world. But things are changing very quickly, and we see many countries more and more trying to find new alternatives in terms of financial systems, payment mechanisms, trade arrangements. I discussed part of this in March when Chinese President Xi Jinping traveled to Moscow and met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And in that meeting, China and Russia discussed plans to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar. And Chinese President Xi promised change is not seen in 100 years. One of the most important topics discussed in this meeting between Xi and Putin on March 21st was de-dollarization, the campaign to replace their trade with US dollars. And you can see this very clearly in the notes that were published by the Russian government. Putin said, quote, "It is important that our national currencies are increasingly used in bilateral trade, that is trade between China and Russia." Putin said we should continue promoting settlements in national currencies and expand the reciprocal presence of financial and banking structures in our country's markets. He noted that 2/3 of the trade between China and Russia is already done using their own currencies, the Russian ruble and the Chinese renminbi. The official name of the Chinese currency is the renminbi, and the unit of account is the yuan. And Putin said that Russia also supports using Chinese yuan in transactions between Russia and its partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this was a public call by the Russian leader to de-dollarize trade between Russia and countries in the global south. In March and April 2023, just in the span of a few weeks, we have seen a rapid acceleration in the global drive to de-dollarize. China's newspaper, The People's Daily, announced on March 28th that China completed its first ever yuan settlement of liquefied natural gas trade, and that was done through China's Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange, buying liquefied natural gas, LNG, that was imported from the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. This was a historic development because for decades, the vast majority of oil and gas, basically all of it, sold by the countries in the Persian Gulf, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, these are some of the world's largest oil and gas producers. For decades, basically all of their transactions were done in dollars. But now we're seeing that they're selling their oil and gas to China in China's currency, the renminbi. France's media outlet RFI acknowledged that this historic transaction in which China is officially buying energy from the Persian Gulf in yuan challenges the petrodollar system. This refers to the fact that the US dollar is used, at least it has been for decades, in the vast majority of the international trade of oil. And this means that it increases the demand for dollars around the world because countries that need to import oil, countries that don't produce oil, which is most countries, have to get dollars in order to pay for that oil. And this petrodollar system also strengthens the hegemony of the US dollar because central banks around the world, when they receive those dollars, they often end up investing those dollars in US Treasury securities, which is US government debt, because that has interest on it. Whereas if you just hold dollars, they depreciate over time with inflation. So what that means is that central banks around the world buy US government debt, which helps to finance US government spending. So there's a circular flow of dollars where dollars are used to buy oil and those dollars are circulated back into the US economy to finance US government spending. So this petrodollar system is extremely important to understand the hegemony of the US empire politically and economically. The French media outlet RFI noted that not only did China buy LNG from the UAE, but it did so through a French company called Total Energy. So what this means is we now see European companies, European traders doing business with China in other currencies that aren't the dollar and aren't the euro. This French media outlet described this transaction as, quote, a major step in Beijing's attempts to undermine the US dollar as the universal petrodollar for gas and oil trade. It also notes that this transaction, the other side, the Chinese importer, was the China National Offshore Oil Company, which is a state-owned company. So this is being backed by the Chinese government. And the article quotes the chairman of the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. And this chairman described the transaction as part of a campaign to promote multi-currency pricing, settlement, and cross-border payment. So what we're talking about is a multipolar economic system. I'll come back to that point in a bit here. This article in the French media outlet RFI actually includes a tweet from me, which I didn't notice until I was looking for mainstream media articles about these developments. And my tweet was emphasizing how historic this transaction was. But the article also points out that in December, Chinese President Xi visited the Persian Gulf region. He visited Saudi Arabia, where he met with not only Saudi leaders, but also leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council and representatives of the Arab League. And in that meeting, Xi announced that China is going to be buying energy from the Persian Gulf in its own currency. Xi's exact quote was, "China will continue to import large quantities of crude oil from Gulf countries, expand imports of liquefied natural gas, strengthen cooperation in upstream oil and gas development, and fully use the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange as a platform to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade." Now, just that transaction was historic and is worth its own episode just analyzing it, but it's one of many examples of global de-dollarization escalating. In another historic development, on March 30th, China announced that Beijing and Brazil signed a deal to ditch the dollar in their bilateral trade. Chinese media outlet CGTN described this saying, "China and Brazil have reached a deal to trade in their own currencies, ditching the US dollar as an intermediary. The deal will enable China, the world's second largest economy, I would say actually That's in nominal GDP terms, but actually, if you look at PPP, purchasing power parity terms, China is the largest economy. But anyway, the point is, this deal will enable China and Brazil, which is the biggest economy in Latin America and around the sixth or seventh biggest in the world. It will allow them to conduct their massive trade and financial transactions directly, exchanging yuan for reais, which is the Brazilian currency, the real or reais, instead of going through the dollar. China is Brazil's biggest trading partner, and just in 2022, the countries did more than $150 billion worth of trade with each other. So this is a massive development that is going to fuel de-dollarization. I should also add, of course, that the Brazilian president, the leftist Lula da Silva, has announced that Latin America is working on developing its own currency to end the region's dependence on the US dollar, and it's likely going to be called the sur. I have a separate report about that I'll link to in the description below. Now, in the same week, on March 28th, the new development bank, which is known as the BRICS Bank, announced that Brazil's former president, Dilma Rousseff, is the new president of the new development bank. She is now living in Shanghai, China, which is where the headquarters of the new development bank is located. Dilma Rousseff is a leftist from the Workers' Party. She is an ally of Lula da Silva, the new president of Brazil. And the fact that she is now the leader of the new development bank shows that the BRICS Bank is going to significantly try to expand its operations in the global south. The NDB, the New Development Bank, was created by the BRICS system, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, as an alternative to the US-dominated World Bank. The US is the only country with veto power, and the World Bank was created as part of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, which made the US dollar the global reserve currency. So we're seeing a huge tectonic shift in the global economic architecture, and the new leftist president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, is kickstarting this campaign.
Og det da man kan begynne å lure på hun her som stod på World Economic Forum for 10 måneder siden, som leder for DNB. Hvem det hun jobber for?
Her har vi jo da sjefen for DNB i Norge, bankene, og de er ikke noe bedre enn de andre, men de er så store at de er nok det tryggeste akkurat nå.
We need to accept that there will be some pain in the process. The pace that we need will open up for missteps. It will open up for shortages on energy. It will create inflationary pressures, and maybe we need to start talking about that pain is actually worth it, because if we don't, there's no business case, there's no economy, there's no welfare. But so far, I think we have been a little bit careful actually talking about the pain in the short term that is likely to come from this very important change. Yeah. We need to accept that there will be some pain in the process. The pace that we need will...
Hvorfor snakker du ikke om BRICS og olje og petrodollar og alt dette her greiene? Du snakker om pein her i økonomisk forum. Hvorfor informerer du ikke? Der sitter du og snakker om vi skal ha pein, og vi skal ha pinast og merke dette her med måte og ditt og datt. Det sitter du og snakker om der. Men her i Norge, her hører vi ingenting om dette her, Anna.
Will open up for missteps. It will open up for shortages on energy. It will create inflationary pressures, and maybe we need to start talking about that pain is actually worth it, because if we don't, there's no business case, there's no economy, there's no welfare. But
det er derfor hun har 16 millioner i.
Ja, det kan du ikke 16, du hadde ikke mer enn 15,4, så jeg. Så jeg, ja. 15,4 millioner har hun i lønn for å skal liksom, ja, hva du betalt det for? Og pine det norske folket, næringslivet. Hun er rådgiver til denne her Støre og dette her greiene. Det er løye at du kan kjøre hele norske på dass, hele næringslivet, for hun får jo 15,4 millioner i fjor i lønn. Storbankkonsernleder, altså Bråten er fortsatt den best betalte storbankens konsernsleder, som til sammen tjente 84 millioner kroner. Det er helt sjukt. Det er helt sjukt hvordan bankene har lederne. Og de hopper og gjør akkurat så de får sånn en høy lønn, så gjør de akkurat så makteliten ville. For de har jo ikke sjanse å få sånn noen andre plasser. Så har de ikke moral overhodet. Det viser det. Penger, det kan gjøre alt med folk. Masse folk blir kvalme. Bytt bank. Det bare nytter ikke, for at de har all makt, bankene. De samarbeider. Så det er det vi endte opp med i denne her. Sitter her og snakker i Davos med disse herrene karene der. Sitter du og snakker om hvordan vi skal få det her i Norge. Vi må ta litt, tåre litt. Så har vi selv. Ja, det er det vi kaller for dobbeltmoral. Og hvorfor går det ikke ut og sier dette, at vi må tåre dette i Norge? Hvorfor han herrene i DNB herrene som holdt dette herrene med filmen, hvorfor så tår ikke han å si dette herrene i Norge? Er det bare noen som skal få den informasjonen her, de som er på Davos i hop med horene, som var nå i januar? Det var jo så grevet med hore. Det var enten det sniffet de så ut av i helvete med altså, stoffen i nasen, i finansbransjen, at de aldeles hjernebedøvde. Det er kun det de går og tenker på prisene på. Jeg forstår ingenting av dette her styret lenger.
And he himself was a co-founder of the BRICS. So this is all happening so fast. So I talked about how China, Russia, and Brazil are de-dollarizing, and they're not alone. The countries in Southeast Asia are also moving forward to drop the US dollar. And this is published in a report on ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And on March 28th, the same day that Dilma became president officially of the New Development Bank in China, there was a meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors of the Southeast Asian nations in Indonesia. And top of their agenda was discussions to reduce dependence on the US dollar, euro, yen, and British pound from financial transactions and move to settlements in local currencies. This means that an ASEAN cross-border digital payment system could be expanded further and allow ASEAN states to use local currencies for trade. An agreement for this cooperation was made in November in 2022 between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand, all Southeast Asian nations. Furthermore, Indonesia is pushing forward on this. The Bank of Indonesia, the central bank of the country, is preparing to introduce its own domestic payment system. Now, this is huge because Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous country after the US. It's China, India, the US, and Indonesia. And Brazil is the sixth most populous country on earth. So the fourth and fifth most populous countries, each of which have more than 200 million people in their population, are trying to de-dollarize and use their local currencies. This is a huge blow to US dollar hegemony and therefore to US economic hegemony and US imperialism. The president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, who's often known as Jokowi, he has urged regional administrations in Indonesia to start using credit cards issued by local banks and gradually stop using foreign payment systems. And specifically, he cited the Western sanctions imposed on Russia as a reason. Out of all of the Southeast Asian nations, only Singapore has imposed sanctions on Russia. It's the only country in the region. All of the other ASEAN nations have continued to trade with Russia, and they're concerned about the threat of US secondary sanctions. That is, not only sanctions on Russia, but sanctions on countries that trade with Russia, or sanctions on countries that trade with China, which is also sanctioned by the US. So these countries are seeking new economic alternatives. This shows how, ironically, with the economic warfare waged by the West against Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela, it's actually accelerating the decline of Western economic hegemony and the decline of Western imperialism that has dominated the world for decades and even centuries, going back to the colonial era. But they're constant economic war on independent countries is forcing countries around the global south to find new economic alternatives because they're afraid that they could be the next target. Now, speaking of Southeast Asia, this brings me to Malaysia. Malaysia and China are also discussing ways to de-dollarize their trade, and they're even talking about creating an Asian monetary fund to challenge the US-dominated International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which was also created as part of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And like the World Bank, the US is the only country that has veto power in the IMF. So this is an article in Bloomberg on April 4th, Malaysia, China to discuss Asian fund to cut US dollar dependency. China is open to talks with Malaysia on forming an Asian monetary fund, said Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, reviving a decades-old proposal to reduce reliance on the dollar. Now, it's important that they know that this is decades old, and what that shows is that the recent escalation in the use of illegal unilateral sanctions by the US and Europe has incentivized countries more and more to find new economic alternatives. They've wanted to have alternatives to US dollar hegemony for decades, but in the past few years, and really in the past few months, that process has drastically accelerated, especially with the proxy war in Ukraine, and with Western governments essentially stealing $300 billion of the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves. The US and European countries have frozen those reserves, and they're going to steal that money from Russia, and allegedly they say they're going to use it to rebuild Ukraine. So that's a massive act of theft. It came after the US stole billions of dollars from Iran's central bank. The US and European countries stole billions of dollars from Venezuela's central bank, and the US has stolen billions of dollars from Afghanistan's central bank. So countries around the world are scrambling to find alternatives now. And Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar stressed the need to reduce reliance on the US dollar and the International Monetary Fund. He said, quote, "There is no reason for Malaysia to continue depending on the dollar." The Malaysian central bank is working on creating a system so China and Malaysia can do trade with each other in their local currencies, the ringgit and the renminbi. And this came after former officials in Singapore discussed what economies in Southeast Asia could do to mitigate the risks of a still strong dollar that's weakened local currencies and become a tool of economic statecraft. When they say economic statecraft, they mean economic warfare. But the US uses the dollar as a political weapon. And they know that the dollar's strength is a headache for Asian nations, including Malaysia, which is a net importer of food. Now, what they're referring to there is that as the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, raises interest rates, it makes the US dollar more valuable because it makes it more expensive to lend money in the US dollar. There are fewer US dollars in circulation. So what that means is that many other countries, unless their central banks significantly raise their interest rates, their currencies are devaluing against the US dollar. We're also seeing a lot of capital flight out of countries because now that the US dollar is more valuable, a lot of people are storing their wealth, their dollars, in the US banking system. And especially with growing instability, volatility in the banking system. So what that means is that a lot of currencies in the global south are weakening against the US dollar. So countries in the global south that import food and fertilizer and medicine and technology and oil and gas, they need to get dollars or other foreign currencies usually to import those commodities. And as the price of those commodities increases and as their own currencies devalue against the dollar, it makes it more and more expensive for them to import products. That's fueling inflation. And of course, if their central bank...
Det som han sier der, det er jo akkurat det Norge også er utsatt for nå. Vi også importerer mye dette gjødsel og fôr og alt mulig, varer og alt mulig til Norge. Låg krone, prisstigning i verden, det gjør at enorm inflasjon får vi i Norge.
Raise interest rates, it's going to make it more expensive to borrow money, and that means that it's going to cause basically a recession, or it's going to do economic damage to their countries. So that means this is a significant factor also in countries around the world seeking alternatives to the US dollar and trying to do trade in local currencies with the other country that they're doing bilateral trade with. Yet another example of this can be seen in trade between Russia and India, which is also increasingly involving other currencies, not dollars, but rather the Russian ruble and the Indian rupee. Reuters reported on April 3rd that Russia has shifted to the Dubai benchmark in Indian oil deals, and Russia's largest oil producer, Rosneft, and India's top refiner, the Indian Oil Corporation, agreed to use the Asia-focused Dubai oil price benchmark in their latest deal to deliver Russian oil to India. Reuters notes that both of these companies are state-owned. So it's another example of Russian and Indian government involvement in these important economic decisions. And it notes that this is part of Russia's abandonment of the European market and its shift toward oil sales toward Asia. Now, specifically, Russia had been selling its oil using the Europe-dominated Brent benchmark, there are three main oil benchmarks in the world, which is the Brent, which is the Europe-focused, the Asia-focused Dubai, and also the West Texas-focused. And what this really means is that, look, if you're buying oil, not all forms of oil are the same. There's heavy crude, light crude, sweet crude, whatever. I mean, there's a variety, sour crude. So what that means is that when customers are buying oil or when exporters are selling oil, they frequently use a benchmark, which is the standard price that's used for those specific markets. So by shifting to the Dubai oil price benchmark, as opposed to the Europe-focused Brent benchmark, it represents Russia's overall economic shift toward Asia and away from the West. Reuters quoted the chief executive of Rosneft, which is the Russian state-owned oil company, and he noted that the price of Russian oil is going to be determined outside of Europe, instead with Asia, because Asia has become the largest market for Russian oil. Now, I've talked about China, Russia, Latin America, and Brazil, Southeast Asia. Let's talk about Africa, because we're also seeing more and more countries in Africa who are seeking alternatives to US dollar hegemony. And Kenya announced this March that it made an agreement to buy oil from the Persian Gulf region using its own currency, the Kenyan shilling. And this is because of a shortage of US dollars in Kenya's foreign exchange reserves. A Nigerian newspaper noted that the Kenyan government has signed an agreement with 3 international oil companies that will allow the African nation to purchase oil using Kenyan shillings. Kenya signed an agreement for the supply of oil for 9 months based on credit using its own local currency with Saudi Aramco, the Saudi state-owned oil giant, with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company of the UAE, and with the Emirates National Oil Company, also of the UAE. This is part of an attempt to ease pressure on Kenya's foreign exchange reserves. It's running out of dollars because it's paying for imports. And oil marketers will also start paying for goods with their own currency, the shilling, rather than dollars. And this brings me to the last article that I'm going to look at today, which is from the Financial Times, one of the leading financial newspapers. And this article was not written by just anyone. It was written by Gillian Tett, who is the chair of the editorial board and the editor of the US branch of Financial Times. So she is one of the most important people at the Financial Times and one of the most important people in the financial press in the West. And she published an op-ed titled "Prepare for a Multipolar Currency World." She began her article as I began this analysis, pointing out that in the most recent trip between Xi and Putin in Moscow, they pledged to increase bilateral trade in local currencies, and Putin called for Russia to do trade with other countries, other regions around the world in yuan as opposed to dollars. She notes that also this comes at a time of US banking turmoil, inflation, and the looming debt ceiling battle in the US, which is making dollar-based assets less attractive. The former Goldman Sachs economist, Jim O'Neill, who coined the term BRICS in the first place, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, he admitted that, quote, "The dollar plays far too dominant a role in global finance." So that's changing very rapidly. The Financial Times noted that even before President Xi visited Moscow, the Saudi government announced it will start invoicing some of its oil exports to China in renminbi. France did its first LNG sale in renminbi. Brazil has embraced the currency for its trade with China, all things I've talked about today. She notes that the dollar's proportion of global foreign exchange reserves in central banks around the world has shrunk from 72% in 1999 to 59% today. So it still is the most commonly used currency in central bank foreign exchange reserves, but that's changing over time. And she notes that central bank digital currencies could accelerate this diversification away from dollars, so de-dollarization, by making it easier for other countries' central banks to deal directly with each other in their own currencies. I should point out that there's been a lot of propaganda demonizing the concept of central bank digital currencies, saying that it's going to be used for mass surveillance and all this, as if that doesn't already happen. But the reality is that central bank digital currencies could be a very important tool for countries to de-dollarize. I think that's why a lot of right-wingers, in the US who support US imperialism and US dollar hegemony are spreading this idea that central bank digital currencies are evil because, of course, they don't want other countries' central banks to use other currencies. They want them to stick with the US dollar in order to help maintain a US economic hegemony. Now, the Financial Times, to be fair, does say that the dollar is still considered by many investors to be the least ugly option in a very ugly world. So I don't want people to think that the dollar is going to collapse overnight. I'm not one of those people. The sky is not falling. I'm not telling everyone that their savings are going to be worthless in 5 years or even 10 years. But what we're seeing is not the complete collapse of the US dollar system, but rather a multipolar currency world. Exactly what the Financial Times has acknowledged. That's what we're moving toward. And China doesn't plan on replacing the US as the global hegemon. China doesn't want to be an empire. China wants a multipolar world with true international democracy where countries don't have to subordinate themselves and their interests to the imperial core, to the United States, to Europe. Now, the Financial Times points out that part of the increase in the rise of the use of the yuan around the world reflects the rise of China as the world's largest economy, according to purchasing power parity. And the Financial Times notes that as Chinese trade has expanded in recent years, use of the renminbi has also risen. And actually now, the renminbi's use in trade invoicing exceeds the use of the euro. So more and more, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, is becoming more used than the European currency, the EU currency. And furthermore, we're already seeing the emergence of a $200 billion offshore renminbi market. The currency is being used in invoicing and settling China's foreign trade and payments, and a global network of clearing and payments. So what that means is that just as the US dollar, although it is printed, at least digitally, by the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the US dollar is a global currency, and there are offshore dollar markets known as the euro dollar system, right? Across Europe, there is a dollar market, like for instance, in the city of London, and around the world, you can open bank accounts in dollars. Well, increasingly, we're also seeing the emergence of offshore renminbi markets, and more in places like Russia and other countries, you can start opening bank accounts in renminbi, in yuan. The Financial Times refers to this as a multipolar currency world that could emerge in the coming years. And again, this is an article by the chair of the editorial board of the Financial Times. So the Western financial press is acknowledging this move toward multipolarity. Unfortunately, the political class in Washington, in Brussels, in London, they refuse to acknowledge this reality. They're in denial, and that's why they're waging a new Cold War on China and Russia and other independent countries in an attempt to strangle the infant of multipolarity in its crib. That's their intention. They want to prevent the emergence of this multipolar world in an attempt to maintain US-led unipolar imperial hegemony. But as I talk about constantly here at Geopolitical Economy Report, that's a fool's errand because it's clearly inevitable. We're seeing a significant decline in US imperial hegemony and the increasing democratization, not only of the global political system, but even more importantly, the global economic system, with more and more alternatives to the US dollar and Western economic hegemony, which provides new alternatives and it provides new opportunities and breathing space for countries around the world, in the global south in particular, who want to have new economic systems that are new alternatives to the US-led neoliberal capitalist system. So we're seeing new models, socialism with Chinese characteristics, forms of economic nationalism, developmentalism, new socialist models, new returns to Keynesianism and import substitution industrialization all across the world, especially in the global south. And that is being facilitated by the emergence of this multipolar economic and financial order. With that, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. And if you want to support the work that we can do here, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support. And there's a few ways you can provide support to us. Another important way would be becoming a patron over at patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. We are completely independent. We have no institutional support. We rely on small donations from listeners and viewers. And by the way, if you are watching or listening, please subscribe on whatever the platform is. I'm Ben Norton. I'm editor of Geopolitical Economy Report, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks a lot.
Og da kan vi gå inn og se litt på slutten her på Norge. Hva norske medier er veldig opptatt med hva hun tjener ut av DNB-sjefen. Men hvorfor skriver de ikke noe mer om dette her med sånne viktige som det han har snakket om her i norske medier? At hun har kjøpt en bolig til 41 millioner. Ja vel, det viser jo bare hvor gale det er. Hun har ikke tid til å være banksjef, hun må tenke hva hun skal ha det i denne flotte boligen sin. Den 40 millioner som hun kjøpte nå i 2022. Det er det som media er mest opptatt av i Norge. Så klart at folk har sånne lønninger, så de tenker ikke det som vanlige mann i gata i Norge er opptatt av. Da tjente du i 2021 15 millioner, ja. Det er helt sånn, helt utrolig hvordan det er lagt til. Så vi har litt om DNB. Historien til dem. Det er jo akkurat det samme som har skjedd med at vi har hatt fullt av småbanker i Norge opp igjennom, så de sleier sammen. Noen er blitt større. DNB er blitt den største, men det er jo bare fullt av banker de har slått seg sammen med tidligere. Og det er jo det som skjer nå også. Antagelig ender vi opp med det bare DNB som er igjen i Norge, for vi har ikke brukt for mer den digitaliseringen som nå foregår. Om 2-3 år så er det sikkert ikke andre banker igjen. Og det er derfor hvorfor hun skal ha sånne greier betaling, for hun ikke skal kjøpe den for. Hun skal glemme hva som er moral og ja, hva som er normalt i dette landet. Jeg vet ikke, men det er helt idiotisk sånn som systemet er blitt i Norge. Altså ungdommene, de skal starte som gjeldsslaver før de kommer i arbeid, og så skal de inn i dyre boliger, og så skal... Ja, nei, det er som målbo som det går an å bli, dette her systemet. Det er rett og slett målbo-opplegg de holder på med. Så alle vet jo dette skala systemet her, at noen skal tjene så grassat, og noen skal ikke ha til salt i grauten mest en gang. Ja, de er ikke bolig, de er ikke mat, de lever fra hånd til munn. Alle vet, vi kan ikke ha et samfunn som er sånn. Så enkelt er det bare, for det avler så mye kriminalitet og faenskap. Men det virker som at her rikingene, om de har fått for mye kvitt pulver i seg, eller hva det er for noe, jeg vet da faen, jeg forstår det er mye av det i denne finansbransjen. Så gjør at de rett og slett blir hjerneskade. Om det er det som gjør det, at de går på en rus. For jeg vet ikke hvem som ikke gjør det, men når jeg sitter i forstanden, så er det veldig utbredt i finanssystemet. Har du da vært i finanssystemet for å få en sånn jobb, så har du vel Så vil han senskade igjen. Nei, jeg vet det, faen. For noe må det være, for det er ikke fornuftig det de holder på med. En forklaring må det være hvorfor de holder på, og hvorfor vi har fått denne utviklingen her. Makteliten og politikerne, alt det der greiene jobber sammen. Det er makt og penger. Makt og penger, makt og penger. Det er kun det handler om. Det skal være nok.